voice low, deliberate. Every word feels like a confession wrapped in thunder. There are places in America where silence is not peace. It's containment, where the soil doesn't forget what men tried to bury. And if you stand in the right place, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the echo of prayers that were never answered. In the rolling plains of Illinois, there stands an abandoned building with no official history. The locals call it the Seminary that swallowed its priests. The Catholic Church calls it a misunderstanding, but the archives tell another story, a story sealed beneath Vatican orders since 1863. 17 young priests vanished within 15 years, not transferred, not reassigned, erased. You weren't supposed to hear that. And yet, here you are. Maybe it wasn't curiosity that brought you here. Maybe it was something deeper. Something that's been trying to wake up inside you. The first rule of control is narrative. Whoever writes the story owns the truth. For centuries, institutions like the church didn't just control the faithful. They defined what could be believed. And when reality threatened that control, it was rewritten, sanctified, or destroyed. Sacred Heart Seminary was not just a school, it was an experiment. A controlled environment built to shape minds, test obedience, and isolate belief until it became submission. The official records say the men who ran it were scholars from Ireland, but hidden beneath the chapel floorboards were letters, signed in blood, revealing they weren't priests at all. They were imposters, fugitives, and traffickers in something far older than theology. One investigator described the building's basement as a sanctum of reversed faith, a place where the rituals of light were spoken backward. He disappeared 2 weeks later. His notes were confiscated. His name was stricken from church ledgers as if he'd never existed. But the walls remember, and so do the families who were told their sons died of fever, or madness, or spiritual corruption. What if obedience was never holiness, but the first step toward enslavement? And what if the church knew exactly what it was doing? They arrived with forged letters, silk vestments, and the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing no one will question you when you wear the symbols of God. 3 men, Edmund Walsh, Thomas Murphy, and Patrick O'Brien, appeared in Illinois in the winter of 1846, claiming divine assignment, but none of them had ever taken vows. None had been ordained. Their names weren't listed in any diocesan record in Ireland or Rome. They were ghosts cloaked in the cloth. Their arrival was perfectly timed. The church was desperate. Desperate to prove loyalty to a hostile Protestant America, and desperate to populate its new frontier with American priests. The bishops were too busy protecting image to verify credentials. And so, the gates opened. The wolves entered investments. Walsh was the strategist, tall, silver-bearded, his voice refined, hypnotic. He understood one thing perfectly: belief is not built on truth but repetition. He didn't preach faith. He engineered dependence. He taught his students that obedience wasn't just duty. It was salvation. Murphy, the second, managed the books, the financial arteries that fed their operation. He created paper trails that led to phantom parishes, non-existent missions, and fictitious transfers. O'Brien, younger, eloquent, and cold as glass, handled the boys directly. His sermons were emotional warfare, dissolving boundaries between devotion and surrender. Within a year, Sacred Heart became less a seminary and more a containment system. Isolation disguised as holiness. The men couldn't write home without approval. Their mail was censored, rewritten, then sealed again. Letters to families were carefully edited to maintain the illusion of peace. They were trained to confess every thought, every impulse, every flicker of doubt. The priests told them it was purification, but it was conditioning. Walsh called it spiritual refinement. In truth, it was psychological dismantling. Remove identity, replace it with doctrine, teach submission as the highest form of faith. At night, under candlelight, the priests held closed door, penitential rites. No one outside the seminary ever witnessed them, but some students reported strange symbols burned into the chapel floor, marks that didn't belong to any Christian order. By spring of 1848, the first student vanished. The church would claim he left for missionary service, but Walsh made no effort to hide the satisfaction in his eyes when the others wept during morning prayers. It wasn't about faith anymore. It was about control, the oldest ritual of them all. The first disappearance changed the air. It wasn't spoken of, not openly. But something invisible shifted through the halls like a presence that everyone felt and no one could name. Meals grew quieter, prayers longer. Even the laughter that used to echo after study hours was replaced by whispers and glances toward locked doors. Michael Brennan's empty bed was never touched. Father Walsh ordered it to remain perfectly made, a symbol of sacrifice, he said. But Joseph Kennedy, his roommate, saw the truth in small details: the unwashed cup on the desk, the rosary still hanging from the bedpost, the coat still folded by the footboard. Michael hadn't left. He'd been taken. That week Joseph began to notice patterns, small but precise. Every month, one student was selected for new duties. Each one would spend increasing time in the administrative wing, then vanish soon after, always at night, always during storms, when wind masked movement and thunder concealed the sound of wagon wheels. One night, Joseph heard them. Horses outside, hooves muffled in snow, the faint grind of iron wheels turning against frozen ground. He crept to the window but saw nothing except the dark outline of the chapel's spire against a pale moon. Then came the voices, low, hurried, and in a language that wasn't English or Latin. It was older, rhythmic, almost musical. He wrote the syllables in his prayer journal, hoping to decipher them later. The next morning, that page was gone. Walsh summoned him after breakfast. "Curiosity," he said, "is the devil's first language." Joseph was confined to the basement chapel for a week of solitary atonement. The basement wasn't holy. It reeked of damp stone iron and old smoke. There was no cross, no altar, only a single wooden chair chained to the floor. The candlelight barely reached the walls. And yet, beneath the silence, Joseph could hear something. A rhythm, like breathing, like movement behind the walls. Once he swore he heard a faint, stifled cry. He prayed harder, but the prayers came back hollow, as if the air itself refused to carry them upward. When his confinement ended, Joseph wasn't the same. He moved differently, watched differently, and in the mirror of his own reflection, he began to see what the priests had created. Not a seminary, but a theater of obedience. He didn't yet know it, but the descent had only begun. It began with a sound, faint, metallic, rhythmic, echoing through the floorboards beneath Joseph's dormitory late one night. It wasn't the creak of pipes or the groan of old wood. It was measured, deliberate, like tools striking stone. He followed it barefoot through the corridor, careful to avoid the lantern light spilling from the priest's quarters. At the far end of the hall, behind a tapestry of the Sacred Heart, he found a small wooden door he had never noticed before. It was locked, but a cold draft slipped through its cracks, carrying the scent of something unmistakably wrong: decay and iron. The next day, Joseph watched as Father Murphy descended those same hidden stairs with 2 laborers from the nearby town. When they emerged hours later, their faces were ashen, their eyes glassy, as if they'd seen something that language couldn't hold. Neither man returned to work the following day. By the week's end, both had left town entirely. Joseph knew the priests were watching him. He could feel it in their stares during Mass, especially Father O'Brien's, who smiled like a serpent feigning warmth. But fear had evolved into something else now, defiance born of clarity. He began searching at night, memorizing guard routines, counting footsteps, tracing the seminary's architecture in his mind, until he could navigate its darkness by instinct. In the library's restricted section, he found a set of ledgers, not financial accounts, but names. Each one belonged to a missing student. Next to every name was a date, a Latin phrase, and a symbol resembling an inverted cross entwined with serpentine loops. The same mark, Joseph realized, he'd seen carved faintly into the chapel's altar, half hidden beneath the cloth. On the final page was a name written differently, not by a priest's hand, but scrawled hastily in pencil, almost pleading, Michael Brennan, beneath the chapel. Forgive me. That night, Joseph returned to the basement door. The lock had been replaced with iron bolts, but he was beyond caution now. Using a candle and a chisel stolen from the maintenance room, he forced it open. The air hit him like a physical blow, damp, heavy, and thick with the smell of blood and earth. The staircase spiraled downward into absolute darkness, and from below came a whisper that was not his own. The staircase curved like a serpent's spine, narrowing with every step. The deeper Joseph went, the less it felt like a basement, and more like a descent into something prehistoric. A place that existed before the church had language to name it. The air grew colder, wetter, almost sentient. His candle flickered as if resisting the descent. The final step opened into a chamber, circular, stone-lined, and far older than the seminary above it. The walls were carved with symbols that pulsed in the candlelight. Geometric patterns intertwined with Latin phrases rewritten backward. In the center stood an altar made not of marble, but of black limestone veined with crimson streaks that looked disturbingly organic. The surface was scarred by shallow cuts, grooves where liquid had once pooled and run off into drains. Joseph froze when he saw them. The chains. They hung from the ceiling in precise symmetry, 16 in total, each with rusted cuffs still bolted to stone rings in the floor. A 17th lay broken, snapped clean as if wrenched apart by impossible strength. He counted them again, his breath catching. 17, the same number as the missing priests. On the far wall, a fresco shimmered faintly under his candle's glow. A depiction of the Sacred Heart, but mutilated. Instead of a heart aflame, the image showed a heart pierced and inverted, bleeding downward into open mouths drawn beneath it. Around the edges were 3 figures robed in black, their faces hidden behind golden masks. Beneath the mural, scratched crudely into the plaster, were words that made his blood run cold. Domini non sunt illi. They are not of the Lord. Then he heard movement, footsteps descending, slow, deliberate. He doused his candle and pressed himself into the shadows. 3 voices echoed in the chamber. Walsh, Murphy, and O'Brien. Their tones were calm, ritualistic. He could hear the scrape of metal, the pouring of liquid, the steady rhythm of chanting not found in any liturgy he'd ever learned. They spoke of offerings, of the 17th vessel, of atonement through inversion. Joseph's heart pounded. He wanted to run, but curiosity chained him harder than fear. He leaned closer, just enough to see the golden masks gleam in the darkness. And then Walsh turned his head. "Come out, Joseph," he said quietly. "Faith has brought you here." Joseph's blood turned to ice. The 3 priests stood unmoving, their golden masks reflecting the trembling light of their lanterns. Father Walsh's voice echoed through the chamber. Gentle, almost fatherly, yet vibrating with a power that didn't belong to any man. "You've come further than any of the others," he said, stepping closer, the mask catching the light. "The Lord chose you to see the truth. You should be honored." 2 figures emerged from the shadows behind Joseph. The same laborers he'd seen days earlier. Their faces were blank, eyes dull and lifeless, as if their souls had been emptied and replaced with silence. They seized him by the arms, dragging him toward the center of the chamber. He struggled, shouting, kicking, but the air itself felt heavy, muffling every sound. Father O'Brien drew a thin dagger from his robe, its blade etched with the same serpentine symbols that lined the walls. "The church above is hollow," he murmured. This is the true faith. The flesh is the temple, the heart is the offering. They forced Joseph to his knees before the black altar. Walsh began to chant in Latin, not sacred scripture, but something guttural, primal, a reversal of prayer that seemed to drain the warmth from the room. The stone beneath Joseph pulsed faintly, like a living thing. The grooves carved into its surface began to shimmer, with a dark liquid seeping from unseen cracks, and then Joseph saw them. Shapes in the corners of the chamber, half-formed, writhing as though emerging from the walls themselves, shadows that moved independently of light. He recognized the outlines of faces among them, familiar faces. The missing priests. Their mouths were open in silent agony, their bodies stretched thin like parchment, fused into the stone. 17. Father Murphy whispered, "The covenant is incomplete. One must remain flesh to bind the others." A Walsh pressed his palm against Joseph's chest. "You were chosen because you still believe," he said softly. "Faith is the sweetest sacrifice." Joseph's mind splintered between terror and rage. He twisted violently, wrenching free just as the dagger descended. It struck the altar instead, sending a sharp crack through the stone. The chamber groaned, a deep, seismic sound from the earth itself. The priest stumbled. The chains above began to rattle violently, and the shadows began to move toward them. The floor of the seminary trembled beneath Joseph's feet as he burst into the main corridor. The lamps along the walls flickered violently, casting jagged shadows that seemed to crawl upward toward the ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, bells began to toll, not in rhythm, but in panic, as though rung by unseen hands. The entire building groaned, alive and furious. Joseph ran, his lungs burning, his mind a blur of terror and disbelief. Behind him, he could hear the crash of collapsing stone and the guttural cries of something that should not exist. He stumbled into the chapel, once a place of peace, now warped by the chaos below. The crucifix above the altar had split in two, the figure of Christ hanging by one arm, head bowed as if in grief. The candles on the pews burned black. A storm raged outside. Rain hammered against the stained glass windows, lightning illuminating the courtyard beyond. And for an instant, Joseph saw figures standing there. Dozens of them. The vanished priests. Their faces pale, blank, their bodies slick with rain and shadow. They stood in rows, motionless, their eyes reflecting the lightning like shards of glass. Joseph grabbed a brass candle holder, using it to smash through the side door. The wind hit him like a wave, cold and sharp, tearing at his clothes. The courtyard smelled of wet stone and decay. The ground trembled again, and the great bell tower shuddered, a crack spiraling down its spine. He tried to flee toward the main gate, but as he passed the chapel windows, he caught one final glimpse inside. The altar had split completely. From the opening rose a red light, pulsing like a living heart. And above it, suspended in the air, was Father Walsh's golden mask, now filled from within by something luminous and shifting watching him. Joseph ran harder. Behind him, the chapel exploded outward, a roar of stone and fire. Shards of stained glass rained down around him like blood, tinted snow. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the woods, where the seminary's silhouette stood against the lightning, collapsing in on itself, yet somehow pulsing as if breathing. Then, through the thunder, came a sound he would never forget. 17 voices, chanting in perfect harmony, rising from the ruins. And beneath them, another voice, ancient, hungry, and awake. Years passed, yet the sound, that dreadful harmony of 17 voices, never left Joseph's mind. He tried to rebuild his life far from Michigan, taking work in small parishes that would have him, but the church always seemed to find a way to remind him of what he'd seen. A hymn hummed faintly by a passing priest, a Latin phrase whispered during confession, the same inverted symbol carved into a pew, half hidden beneath layers of varnish. The faith he'd once lived for had become a haunting. By 1912, Joseph had stopped preaching altogether. He spent his days in silence, drinking, trying to drown memory in ritual denial. But one morning, while leafing through a regional paper, he saw the headline that froze his blood. Sacred Heart Seminary reopens after 15 years of restoration. The photograph below it showed the same courtyard, pristine and sunlit, the tower rebuilt. The chapel doors open wide, and at the center, standing among the new order of priests, was a face he knew, Father Walsh, older but unmistakable. Joseph's hands shook as he traced the image. Walsh had died in that crypt. He'd seen him consumed. And yet, there he was, smiling, blessing the crowd. Something inside Joseph broke. He packed his few belongings and returned to Michigan under a false name, driven by a force he no longer recognized as courage. Perhaps guilt, perhaps madness. When he arrived, the seminary was immaculate. The air smelled of incense and lilac. The new priests greeted him warmly, their manners soft and polite, but there was something wrong in their eyes. Something hollow, like the memory of light without its warmth. He pretended to be a historian, requesting access to the seminary's early archives. They granted it without hesitation. Down in the library's basement, he found what he was looking for: new ledgers, bound in red leather. But as he flipped through them, the names chilled him. Every one was familiar. The same missing priests, the same symbols. Only the dates were different, updated, current. Then came the voice from behind him. Calm, reverent, and impossibly familiar. "You shouldn't have come back, Joseph." He turned. Father Walsh stood there, unchanged. Not older, not alive, not dead, just returned. For a moment Joseph couldn't breathe. Father Walsh stood framed by the candlelight, his cassock spotless, his hands clasped in quiet serenity. The same golden mask lay around his neck like an ornament, polished, unscarred, impossible. His eyes glowed faintly, not with warmth, but with a dim, unnatural radiance, as if lit from within by something ancient. "I saw you die," Joseph whispered. "I saw the shadows take you." Walsh smiled softly, almost pitying. "You saw the beginning, not the end." He stepped closer, the floorboards creaking beneath him. "You think death was punishment, Joseph. But it was initiation. We have shed the flesh of servants and taken the hearts of gods." The words slithered through the room like smoke. Joseph backed away, his heel striking a small iron grate in the floor. Beneath it, he heard something moving, wet, rhythmic, alive. "The seminary fell," Joseph said, his voice breaking. "It burned. I saw it. Only its shell," Walsh replied. "The body dies, but the faith endures. We rebuilt it from memory, from sacrifice. The earth remembers blood, Joseph. And so do we." Walsh extended his hand. His skin shimmered briefly, revealing veins that pulsed like black threads beneath the surface. "You were chosen once. You still are. We can make you whole again." Joseph's eyes darted toward the exit. Behind Walsh, shadows began to thicken, human silhouettes forming in the candlelight. 17 of them, motionless, surrounding him like disciples awaiting communion. Their faces were indistinct, blurred by some veil between worlds. "I won't join you," Joseph hissed. "You serve nothing holy." Walsh's smile widened. "We serve what the church buried long before it named your God. The heart beneath the altar. The true source of grace. Do you not feel it still beating?" And then Joseph did feel it. Deep beneath the floor, a slow, rhythmic thud that echoed through his bones. The same heartbeat that had shaken the seminary all those years ago. The candles flickered in unison with it. Walsh leaned closer. "It never stopped, Joseph. It's calling you home." The shadows advanced, their feet making no sound. The golden mask rose from Walsh's hand and hovered toward Joseph, gleaming in the dim light. He turned to run. But the door was gone. Only stone remained. The room shifted. The walls rippled like the surface of disturbed water, the mortar between stones flexing as if the building itself were exhaling. Joseph stumbled backward, his hand scraping against the cold floor. The door that had once been there was gone, replaced by seamless stone carved with symbols that seemed to pulse beneath his touch. The air thickened, pressing against his chest, each breath heavier than the last. Walsh stood motionless, head slightly tilted, as if listening to something only he could hear. "Do you feel it now?" he murmured. "The seminary remembers you. It remembers your faith and your fear." The shadows behind him began to move again. 17 forms shifting in unison, faces indistinct yet strangely familiar. Joseph could see flashes of their features, hollow eyes, mouths that twitched as if trying to speak through centuries of silence. They weren't entirely human anymore. Their skin glistened faintly, like marble soaked in oil. Joseph grabbed a brass cross from the nearby table and held it up, his hand trembling. "In the name of God." Walsh laughed softly, and the sound echoed twice, as if the room itself was laughing with him. "Which God, Joseph? The one who abandoned this place, or the one who answered when we called?" The cross in Joseph's hand grew warm, then hot, until it burned his palm. He dropped it with a gasp, watching as it melted into the floor like wax. The ground beneath his feet began to pulse in rhythm with that deep, unholy heartbeat. Through the grate, the movement grew louder, a slithering, rhythmic sound that seemed to crawl upward through the stone. The priests' shadows began to chant, low at first, then rising, their words a reversal of Latin prayer. The walls bled faint streams of red, tracing the old inverted symbol across the room. Walsh stepped closer, his voice calm amidst the growing madness. "The church above teaches salvation," he whispered. But salvation was never the goal. Consumption was. The floor cracked. A hand, skeletal, yet glistening with red, broke through the grate, grasping the air. The chamber trembled as if something vast was awakening beneath it. Walsh's eyes glowed brighter. "It remembers your name, Joseph." And then the stone beneath Joseph's feet split open, swallowing the light, the air, and his final scream. There was no impact, no sense of falling, only the sickening feeling of being drawn downward. Through stone, through air, through something that felt alive. When Joseph opened his eyes, he was no longer in the seminary. He stood in a cavern vast enough to hold a cathedral, the walls glistening with veins of crimson light that pulsed like arteries. The air reeked of iron and incense. The sound of the heartbeat was deafening here. Slow, thunderous, constant. A rhythm older than human memory. The ground beneath him was soft, yielding slightly underfoot. Flesh, not earth. Above, roots hung like tendons, dripping a thick, black fluid that hissed where it met the ground. Joseph staggered forward, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But there was no back, no up, no exit. Only the endless, wet shimmer of the cavern and the pulse that drew him closer. At the center of the chamber rose a structure that was both altar and organism. A colossal mass of muscle and stone fused together, rising and falling in time with that impossible heartbeat. In its surface, Joseph saw faces, hundreds of them, their features distorted in agony and ecstasy, mouths open in silent prayer. Their lips moved, whispering fragments of Latin and screams in between. Then he saw him. Father Walsh stood before the altar, his robes gone, his body half consumed by the living structure. Tendrils of red muscle wrapped around his torso, merging him into the mass. His eyes were open, glowing faintly. "Do you understand now?" he said, his voice echoing from every surface. "This is the true body. The church above only mimics it. Here, faith has form. Here, devotion feeds." Joseph fell to his knees. "You've damned yourselves," he gasped. "This isn't God." A Walsh smiled, or something that looked like a smile rippled across what was left of his face. "If damnation brings eternal life, then damnation is divine." The altar shuddered, a wet, convulsing sound. From its core, a fissure opened, revealing a vast, beating heart, not metaphorical, not symbolic, but real. It pulsed once, twice, then Joseph heard it whisper his name. "Joseph." The sound wasn't air, it was blood moving, and as the veins along the walls brightened, Joseph realized the terrible truth. The seminary above wasn't built over this heart, it was built from it. The whisper of his name rippled through the cavern again, deep and wet, echoing in every vein and artery that lined the walls. Joseph staggered backward, his hands sinking into the pulsing ground that throbbed beneath him like muscle. The air vibrated with a low hum, almost a chant, resonating through his chest until his heartbeat synced unwillingly with the one around him. The voice came again, not from the heart this time, but from within his mind, soft and familiar. You believed once, Joseph. You prayed for truth. This is it. Touch and understand. He looked up at the heart, immense, glistening, impossibly alive. With each beat, the walls flexed, expelling hot air that carried whispers of every sermon he had ever preached, every confession he had ever heard. His faith, his doubt, his guilt, it all pulsed here, given form and flesh. Father Walsh's body twitched against the altar, veins tightening like puppet strings. It remembers you, he said, his voice wet with joy. It remembers the faith you fed it before you turned away. That's why it chose you. Only you can complete the covenant. Joseph's hands trembled. Complete it. You've fed it souls. You've killed for it. Sacrifice his worship. Walsh breathed. It sustains the divine. The words seemed to awaken something in the heart. It beat harder, faster, sending ripples through the floor. The faces embedded in the flesh began to scream now, their mouths widening in agony, releasing bursts of light like bleeding stars. Joseph clutched his head, his vision blurring as memories flooded him. The night he escaped, the priest's cries, the seminary's collapse, all looping, repeating. Then, amid the noise, he heard another voice, fainter, purer, his own. Faith without sight is salvation. Faith with sight is corruption. He realized, suddenly, that the heart wasn't just alive, it was hungry. It had been feeding on belief, on worship twisted into horror. Every prayer, every chant, every ritual, a meal. And Walsh, the others, they weren't its servants, they were its extensions. He stumbled toward the altar, eyes burning with fury. If faith feeds you, he whispered, then let disbelief starve you. He raised the fallen brass crucifix from the ground, molten, glowing red, and drove it into the heart's surface. The cavern screamed. The seminary above began to collapse, and the last thing Joseph heard was his own heartbeat, breaking free. The earth had buried the seminary, but not the sound. For weeks after the collapse, locals whispered about it. How at night, when the prairie wind was still, you could hear a faint pulse beneath the soil. Some said it was the echo of the bell. Others, the groan of the dead. But Joseph knew the truth. It was still alive. He fled Illinois under a false name, carrying with him only one thing, a single page torn from Father Walsh's journal. On it, written in a trembling Latin hand, was a phrase repeated over and over: Cor silentem Deus vivus est. The silent heart is the living God. He would spend the rest of his life trying to decipher it. For decades, he moved from parish to parish, preaching redemption but speaking little of the thing buried beneath Sacred Heart. Yet the nightmares never stopped. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of those trapped souls flickering within that pulsing dark. Sometimes, in moments of deep prayer, he could feel it, like a whisper beneath the words answering him. Feeding. In 1904, long after Joseph's death, surveyors from the archdiocese attempted to rebuild on the old seminary grounds. The project was abruptly abandoned after workers reported strange vibrations coming from underground and found their tools covered in a fine film of dried blood each morning. No explanation was ever recorded. The land was declared spiritually contaminated and sealed by Vatican decree, but history has a way of reopening its own wounds. In 1997, a team of researchers investigating church archives uncovered a series of sealed correspondences. Letters between Cardinal M. and the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, referencing the reawakening of the Illinois site. The Vatican ordered the files destroyed. They weren't. And here's where you come in. Because if you've made it this far, if you've felt the pull beneath these words, it means the echo has found you. These stories don't just tell themselves. They choose who hears them. If you feel that deep vibration in your chest right now, that's not anxiety. That's resonance. The same rhythm that's been waiting under that prairie for over 150 years. Type the phrase, "The silent heart beats still," twice in the comments. Once for remembrance, once for awakening, because truth like this doesn't die. It only waits for someone new to listen.